All right, we've got Megan Kalsman coming up next, and she is a policy researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington. She has previous experience managing environmental programs in local governments, businesses, and nonprofits. She specializes in advancing the procurement of low carbon materials and informs the development and implementation of cross-sectional climate policies targeting embodied carbon. Before joining the CLF, she completed her Master of Science degree at Lund University in Sweden in environmental management and policy. Come on up, Megan. All right, so point the clicker at Todd, and then Bailey has an iPad that's counting down from 10 minutes.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Kalsman. So excited to be here with you today. Keeping with the policy theme, I'm going to be talking about embodied carbon and deconstruction and reuse policies. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about what is embodied carbon, how does it intersect with reuse, look at different policy opportunities to include reuse, and dive into a Portland, Oregon case study. Oops. Oh. So first, what is embodied carbon and why are we talking about it? So embodied carbon is the carbon emissions arising from the whole life cycle of a product or a building. So everything from the materials manufacturing, the transportation of the materials to the site, use, maintenance, repair, and all the way to the end of life, so deconstruction and waste processing as well. This is measured in global warming potential, and we use life cycle assessment to assess global warming potential. So why should we think about embodied carbon? Well, it's actually really crucial to meet our global climate emission goals. And actually the industrial sector, as you can see here, is the largest piece of the pie. It's 30% iron, steel, cement. These are all building materials that are used really commonly, and they actually take really high heat to process. So there's a lot of embodied carbon involved in even making these products. Also, it's important to note that embodied carbon disproportionately impacts frontline and fence line communities. When we're working to reduce embodied carbon, we're working to reduce the global impacts from climate change. Also looking at regional and local impacts as well on health and environment. So for example, these production facilities, manufacturing facilities are near, they're creating pollution, they can create particulate matter. So when we're reducing embodied carbon, we're reducing these local impacts as well. And looking at embodied carbon gives us a great way to address intersecting supply chain concerns. We live in this globalized society, and when we're working to address embodied carbon, we can actually require health requirements. We can look at labor in these manufacturing facilities. So there's so many different ways that we can reduce embodied carbon. So what does it have to do with policy? Well, I'd like to think of embodied carbon falling into 5 different buckets. One, reuse and deconstruction, which I'm talking about today, but also zoning and city incentive programs, procurement or government procurement, even corporate procurement of materials, building codes and regulations, climate action plans that cities and counties are making as well. So there's all these different ways to address embodied carbon. Today, I'm going to talk about reuse and deconstruction, but if you want to learn more about these other types of policies, I encourage you to look at our embodied carbon educational series. As well, we just published a bunch of case studies on the Pacific Coast. So not only in North America, but also Canada as well. So what are different policy opportunities to influence reuse? Oops. Well, first, it's site selection and building design. So in the very beginning of the process, when we're designing this building, we can choose existing buildings to reuse or add on to instead of tearing down a building and starting new. We can really look at sufficiency measures. A related policy here is the Los Angeles Adaptive Reuse Ordinance. We're hearing a lot about circular economy, adaptive reuse in the building industry. So once we know we're making this building, what kind of materials are we going to use? So specifying existing or salvage materials and material longevity. This is a policy opportunity that we've been seeing. Design for disassembly principles. A lot of policies are looking at this as well. One precedent is LEED version 4.1, where they actually included a materials and reuse category that specified you can get a point for using salvage materials in your building. So looking at deconstruction and on-site construction waste diversion, demolition is one really fast and cheap way to get rid of our buildings if we need to start new. But actually, there's a huge policy opportunity for deconstruction and salvage. And salvaging this material, there's so many different materials that can be reused, and this saves materials from going into our landfill as well. I'm going to talk about Portland deconstruction of buildings law, but also here in the Bay, we have Palo Alto deconstruction ordinance, which was passed not too long ago. And what happens with this materials that we're salvaging? Well, we can have warehouses for material storage between uses. There are so many that exist. There's a few here in the Bay as well. So there's a lot of opportunities to store this material so other people and builders can use it in the future. Houston reuse warehouse, we have a few in the Bay as well. Additionally, looking at online platforms to enable designers and contractors to identify available materials out there. So Reaply, this is an online platform, which is really cool, where if I'm a builder, I can look about, I can try to find these materials that are maybe near me and I don't have to transport them all the way. So this just goes to show the policy reuse ecosystem is growing. There is so much going on out there. So I would recommend to check out the All for Reuse map. Looking at Portland deconstruction of buildings law, this one's really cool. It was actually the first policy in the US which was requiring deconstruction. And it's requiring deconstruction for houses, so residential houses, duplexes, and all zones. They have to be, it applies if it was built in 1940 or earlier, and if it's designated as a historic resource. So deconstruction is a great way to influence workforce development. This is a high-skilled job that can boost the local economy. So actually, the city of Portland certified deconstruction contractors, any projects who apply under this ordinance, they have to use one of these certified contractors, which is great. And this is just a study that was done, an analysis. So you can see here the quantity of materials salvaged from an average home. There is so much out there. Softwood lumber, over 9,000 pounds. So there is a huge amount of materials that we can reuse. So the timeline really began even a few years before the ordinance was passed. They began working with different stakeholders. Some of you can see here, so neighborhood advocates, historic preservation advocates, permitting staff, salvage retailers, and so many different ones. They were doing deconstruction versus demolition modeling scenarios to make sure that this was feasible to do. They actually did a phase-in approach where they had a grant program come in so you could get money for doing this even before the ordinance. And so it became law in 2016. So just to wrap up, reuse and deconstruction, it's a really great way to extend the life of a material or building. It avoids extraction and manufacturing emissions from creating a new one, saving embodied carbon. So there's a lot of different policies, some which I covered today: building reuse, deconstruction, salvage, material selection, material reuse, markets, and storage. I talked about the environmental benefits of saving on embodied carbon. There's also economic benefits, boosting the local workforce, having these awesome high-skilled jobs, workforce training programs, and the social aspect as well. So preserving these historical resources and preserving these materials. And I'll leave you with this call to action to contact your local policymakers in your city, wherever you might be. There's so many different ways that we can reduce embodied carbon, and reuse and deconstruction is a great way to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thank you. Yeah, exactly.
All right, we're gonna need some questions, but we do know that now you and Nicole, you need to coordinate with Nicole in order to encourage deconstruction at a state level. All right, who got questions there? Are there any questions online? Okay, questions here, right here.
Hi, Joanne from CPSC. I'm curious how solar panels are managed under deconstruction and reuse ordinances, and if you know of any barriers to solar panel reuse.
Solar panel, that's a good question. So I actually don't know that, for example, in the Portland that it is included. So yeah, I haven't seen a deconstruction ordinance that does include solar panels, but that's really interesting to think about and what happens at their end of life as well. So thank you for that question. I'll look into that.
Jesse Simmons this afternoon will be speaking about solar panels in his, he's got an agency working on that. So I think we're going to go for Deirdre. Did you have a question? Oh, yeah, you have a microphone? Where's our microphone?
We have a microphone at
Oh,
the top.
Okay.
I'm
Arthur?
just
Is your
curious
organization
with,
involved with the
data?
conversion of trucking from diesel and fuel to electric motors at all?
So do we work with transportation? Is that the question?
Again, please.
Do we work with the transport of materials?
Yeah,
Is that your
yeah.
question? Not directly. So the Carbon Leadership Forum, we look at the whole life cycle, but yeah, so we don't exactly work with transportation. And in my work with policy, this is something that we're starting to look into more. So thanks.
And then Deirdre.
Do you know when data will be available to show emissions reduction from deconstruction?
Say that one more time.
Because I wrote it down, I'm like messy handwriting here. It says, do you know when data will be available that will show emissions reduction from deconstruction efforts?
Yeah, this one is really interesting. So it depends on the policy and the agency who is doing this. Portland, so it's been in effect since 2016. And one thing they are tracking is the pounds of material being reduced. So that's what they are tracking right now. As far as emissions reduction, I'm not sure if they're tracking that. Thanks.
I would just like to add, there's a relatively new solar panel reclamation and recycling company. It's called Solar Cycle, and they're at downtown Oakland on Franklin Street.
Thank you so much for that information.
We have one from the virtual audience. Who runs the reuse warehouses?
It depends. I think sometimes the cities run them, but also there can be partnerships like public-private partnerships who are doing these warehouses.
Any other questions? Oh, one more.
Yeah, I'm curious about that 1940 demarcation on that legislation or policy from Portland. Do you know why they selected that year as opposed to 1950 or 1945?
That's a great question. Actually, I also want to mention it used to be 1920, and then they're raising it to 1940 in 2022. So this is something we really want to make sure that we're including as much as we can. And so that's why the limit of the age is actually increasing as we go. And this is a common way to cover more housing. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so thank you for answering that. That's along the lines of my question as well. And so about how many houses are actually in that era? I'm from currently in the peninsula area, and so most our buildings are kind of becoming new. So what is the actual numerical value of having the 1940s houses? Like, is it a small proportion? Is it a large proportion? I'm not as familiar with Portland.
Yeah, I don't know that information either. That's a good question. I think we wanted to make this ordinance like really accessible and for people to comply, be able to comply in an easy way. But yeah, definitely it's ratcheting up over time. So it'll be covering more and more houses for sure. And the one in Palo Alto, actually, you mentioned you're in the Bay. This bill also addresses commercial buildings, so not only residential, but also commercial. So that's an even larger portion of the houses that need to comply.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nicely done.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about that timing, that year of like after 1940, houses started getting more and more toxic with more and more crap added to the building materials.